So, what is so special about Tibetan Buddhism? That's a really good question, actually, because there's so many ways in which I could answer that question. And when I was giving this question some thought, where I landed was that in many ways, Tibetan Buddhism is full of paradoxes, full of, seeming contradictions. So in a way, what is so special about Tibetan Buddhism is that um, running right through it is this series of paradoxes. And I'll just mention a few of them. And, the first and most obvious one in a way is that Tibetan Buddhism is actually very, very Tibetan in terms of culturally Tibetan, but at the same time, it completely is not. So that's, again, a seeming paradox. And let me explain that a bit. If you've ever been to like a traditional Tibetan temple, you'll know they can often be quite overwhelming in many ways and very culturally Tibetan. Like you find these large butter lamps flickering, and they're used as offerings, of course, and have a particular smell. And then particularly at night, there's some statues of wrathful deities and can look a little bit scary almost and quite mysterious, actually. And yeah, this is something you'll not likely see anywhere else, other Buddhist kind of flavors, other temples. And it may be kind of vaguely appealing, but is also decidedly otherworldly, and we may be a bit mystified by it, but what is it really, So it's a very Tibetan side to Tibetan Buddhism. But at the same time, Tibetan Buddhism is completely also not Tibetan. And to illustrate that a little bit, I'll point back to something His Holiness the Dalai Lama often emphasizes. When asked about Tibetan Buddhism, His Holiness often mentions that, what we call Tibetan Buddhism is actually the so-called Nalanda tradition. And that indicates that, what we call Tibetan Buddhism is actually an authentic continuation of the classic Indian Buddhist tradition as it developed between, the time when Buddha passed away, roughly about 5,000 before Christ, and around the 12th century of the Common Era. And this culture culminated in the great monastic universities, of which Nalanda was one of them. So even though what meets the eye when we wander into Tibetan Buddhist temples is actually in a way much like the tip of a vast mountain, and the body and foundation of that mountain consists partly of a scholarly, philosophical tradition that Tibetan translators have painstakingly preserved in the Tibetan language, and also guided by this philosophical tradition. When we set out on the Buddhist path in this Tibetan Buddhist context, there is a lot of emphasis on clear thinking and exposing flaws in our thinking, which, according to, the Buddhist teachings, are at the root of so many of our human problems. Reflection and contemplation, but then also of meditation. Many of the great scholars in the Nalanda tradition were actually also great yogis, great practitioners. And to illustrate that, there's a famous story about Chandrakirti, one of the greatest well-known philosophers of Nalanda. He was a philosopher of the middle way, or Madhyamika. Madhyamika is the philosophy that helps us apply logic and reasoning, and through this come to see and experience for ourselves a reality that is beyond the dualistic mind, where things are seen as dreamlike or illusory or without an essence. And then one day, according to this story, the monastery needed milk, but there were no cows around. And somehow Chandrakirti managed to find milk, and then curious about where he got the milk, someone followed him around and he eventually found Chandrakirti milking a cow that was painted on the monastery wall. This, of course, illustrates how in the Nalanda tradition, great scholarship leads to great spiritual realization, where this dreamlike reality or dreamlike nature of reality is not just a theory, but actually a lived reality, you know? So there are stories like that to illustrate how actually, according to this Indian Nalanda tradition, great scholarship leads to high levels of spiritual attainment. And this tradition was preserved and continued into Tibet. But then, of course, in that process, Tibetan culture became interwoven with how the Buddhist teachings were transmitted and studied and practiced. But what's interesting, I think, is that this philosophically oriented style of Buddhism, at some point in the early history of Tibetan Buddhism, was actually challenged. That was not a given that Buddhism in Tibet would work out that way. It was challenged by a stream of Chinese Buddhism, a stream that was more radical in its approach to the spiritual path, and which claimed that there's not much point to philosophy and not much of a point towards the gradual way of approaching the spiritual path. According to this stream of Chinese Buddhism, enlightenment can only come about through a sudden breakthrough, some kind of cutting through the conceptual mind. So in the end, it came down to a debate between this kind of Zen flavored stream of Buddhism, and then this kind of Nalanda scholarly philosophical practice tradition. And this was a very famous debate, which the memory of which has been kept alive in the Tibetan tradition. And on the Nalanda side, there was a famous Indian master called Kamalashila, who in the end won the debate. And actually, the way that debate actually was decided was very much decisive for the future of Buddhism in Tibet. So the kind of philosophically oriented practice tradition of the Nalanda Buddhism was, through that debate, really safeguarded and secured into the future, and became to really became the, yeah, you could say the identifying kind of characteristic of Tibetan Buddhism. So you see the paradox. Tibetan Buddhism is very Tibetan in the way it expresses itself, but also a continuation of a classic Indian Buddhist tradition, the Nalanda tradition. Another thing that makes Tibetan Buddhism special, and which has an element of paradox built in, is that Tibetan Buddhism is what we could call a non-dual wisdom tradition. Now, this is not so easy to explain simply. Our usual way of thinking is dualistic, in that we divide our world into many different things and beings. Like right now, I am talking to you about Tibetan Buddhism. So in the way I'm even formulating this sentence, I am separate from you, and I'm talking to you about something separate again, called Tibetan Buddhism. This world, or this view of the world where, you know, I am different from you and the rest of my world, discrete people and things and beings, that is a kind of dualistic way of viewing the world. And you could say that's just the way the world is, right? That's how we live and breathe our lives, basically. This is how we approach our world. But Tibetan Buddhism, interestingly, challenges this way of approaching the world. It shows us that when I really search for a discrete entity that is uniquely defined as distinct from others, we can't find it. When I really look into myself, what I call I, my identity, it consists of so many elements that come from what we could call not I, not me. The language I speak, for example, it's not a language I invented. My ideas, of course, are in a way my ideas, but have very much come about through interaction with my world, my education, and everything. The food I eat and so many things that I think of as me are actually not me, or find their origin in something that is definitely not me. So when we really look at it and look into it, it's difficult to maintain these hard and fast boundaries. Everything and everyone is made up of many things, in a way that the whole world the whole universe is actually present in that which we call us. So if we really look closely, we can't find any discrete entity that is separate, that is me, that is separate from the rest of the world. And then, of course, that's important information, because if we live like that, we live based on that view, we're not living in accordance with the way things are. If we treat ourselves as discrete, separate, independent entities, whereas in reality, you and I are completely interdependent, then there is something that is not quite right in our relationship. There's a real me here and a real you out there. Then immediately there is some attachment and aversion. I think I need something from you. I think I need to avoid something out there in the world, and I need to get something else in order to secure my happiness. You see, that's how the story starts to play out after we separate things into self and other, basically. In reality, you and I are completely interdependent. This also in this philosophy is called emptiness. The ultimate nature of I and you and all things like tables and chairs is actually not I and not you. It's empty of I and you. That's something that's called ultimate truth. You and I kind of appear in the way we do, but actually at the same time, when we really look at it, the ultimate nature of I is not I. I don't truly, inherently, separately exist. At the same time, you and I appear, we're having this conversation. That's called relative truth. Now, the really profound aspect of this non-duality is that these two things, the ultimate nature of emptiness, this not I identity that is the essence of what this I that appears and talks is, and this relative I that appears and talks, they always appear together in union. We cannot separate these two. Just as we cannot separate fire from its heat and we can't separate water from its wetness, we cannot separate a thing from its essential non-thingness type nature, its empty nature. We can't separate a flower from its flowerlessness, its ultimate nature. So this is one of the paradoxes that are part of Tibetan Buddhism. Things are both there, they appear, but at the same time, they're not there. We cannot really find anything when we really look for an essential identity. And this is often presented as things being dreamlike. In a dream where things appear and we do things and interact with our dream world, nothing is really truly real, but nevertheless, everything appears and it works. My dream world appears to me and I live in my dream world and I interact with it. This is the profound view that I believe makes Tibetan Buddhism quite special. But it's not unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Many forms of Buddhism that originate in India from around the 2nd century of our Common Era, called Mahayana Buddhism, hold this view. And they apply it very consistently, all the way up to the Buddha and his teachings. In one of the sutras, sutras are like the word of the Buddha, the direct word of the Buddha, Buddha himself says, my dreamlike form appeared to dreamlike beings to show them the dreamlike path that leads to dreamlike enlightenment. So I think this is quite special and unique. This is a spiritual tradition that considers its own teachings and its own teachers to be no more real or no less real than a dream. But here's yet another thing related to that I think that makes Mahayana Buddhism, of which Tibetan Buddhism is part, so unique. And that is compassion. And that's another seeming paradox, in that even though reality is considered nothing more than a dream or an illusion, Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism places a really big emphasis on how we relate to this dream. There are non-dual traditions that are not Buddhist, and these are mostly geared towards helping us see through the unreal appearances and remain in what is ultimately real, this non-dual dimension, without much further regard for the veil of unreal appearances. But in this Nalanda-style non-dual tradition, our approach to these unreal appearances is characterized by compassion, which is a passion for helping all beings realize this dreamlike nature and realize the non-dual ultimate reality. This is called the path of the Bodhisattva. So there's a lot of teachings and practices based on this non-dual view that help us, being good human beings, develop kindness, compassion, and wisdom so that we are of benefit to others. And that makes this non-dual tradition quite special and unique amongst other non-dual traditions. And then going even a little bit further, there's another feature of Tibetan Buddhism that I believe is not only very special, but this is one that actually is quite unique, kind of uniquely identifies Tibetan Buddhism amongst other Buddhist traditions. The masters who established this Tibetan Buddhist tradition had so much compassion that they decided to do whatever they could to communicate to us, deeply dualistic human beings, to communicate in dualistic terms what this experience of non-duality is like. What is it like to experience reality free of this rigid subject-object duality? When we really bring this non-dual union of the two truths directly into experience. This is what the Tibetan Buddhist masters refer to as pure perception or sacred outlook. And Tibetan Buddhism is presenting it to us as enlightened forms called deity and enlightened sound called mantra. And even though these forms and sounds are only symbolic of the non-duality of appearance and emptiness, when we focus on them in the right way and receive the right guidance, we can actually make a deep experiential connection with this non-dual dimension, which is our true nature. And this is again why paradoxically traditional Tibetan temples are full of forms and colors and sounds, aiming to express what is basically inexpressible. This is very uniquely Tibetan and very unlike, for example, the minimalist spaces of Zen temples. The Buddhist teachings, and particularly the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, emphasize this sacred outlook. And this tradition that emphasizes sacred outlook is called Vajrayana Buddhism. And Vajrayana is a Sanskrit word, with Vajra referring to something that is indestructible. And the only thing that is considered truly indestructible is our ultimate true nature beyond duality. Everything else, everything relative, depends on causes and conditions and is destructible. So Vajra represents our true nature, and Yana means vehicle. So Vajrayana gives us a vehicle or an approach that is based on our ultimate true nature, which is the union of ultimate and relative. Vajrayana is based on the view that the awakened state, enlightenment, is right here in the present moment and can be brought into every aspect of the spiritual path. This is why Vajrayana is called the resultant vehicle, because it works directly with our enlightened nature, which is already here and now, who we really are. And we use this enlightened nature to go beyond this dreamlike reality, this mere appearance of this temporary coming together of causes and conditions, our relative reality. From the Vajrayana point of view, our problem is not so much that we don't have wisdom and compassion and love and joy right now, but that we don't recognize what we already have right now. So from this perspective, our world and our reality depend entirely upon our own mind and the way it perceives reality. And so the unsatisfactory nature of our lives that Buddha's teachings speak of is not caused by an inherent problem with the world. Instead, it is a result of our limited, distorted perception. And then founded on this view, Tibetan Buddhism is marked by a rich array of skillful means, which it has nurtured and perfected over hundreds of years. This includes basic meditation practices to calm and stabilize the mind, contemplative methods to awaken in us deep wisdom and vast compassion, visualization practice, mantra recitation, and profound meditation to help us arrive swiftly at a direct realization of our true nature and the nature of reality itself. So during this workshop, this weekend together, we will actually explore some of these methods and how each of them is founded upon the view that they are designed to help us bring into direct personal experience. So Tibetan Buddhism then offers us a complete and multifaceted path. As Buddhism traveled from India to Tibet, and it did that later than traveling to any other Asian countries, it came to embody the most fullest possible version of classic Indian Buddhism. So besides this stream of Vajrayana teachings that became prominent relatively later on in classic India, other approaches that had developed earlier also were preserved into the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Tibetan Buddhism contains all of these, and they're presented as three paths or three vehicles. The first one is the foundational path, emphasizing peace. The second one is the Mahayana path, emphasizing compassion and wisdom. And the third one then is the Vajrayana path, emphasizing transforming our perception and ourselves and the world we live in. So then in Rigpa centers all over the world, each of these three approaches are available to students. So then to say a little bit about how this weekend will be structured and for, who will benefit in which way from participating in the weekend. As I said, a truly special and unique feature of Tibetan Buddhism lies in the skillful guidance it offers for us to really come to know our mind, to connect with our mind deeply and see firsthand how it works. And with that, to an extent, we can become our own master. When we come to know our own mind and how it works and how it creates reality, we can become our own guide. So the weekend in June that we'll spend together exploring these topics will honor this and will be structured around meditation practice and an exploration of our mind. How is it exactly that our mind creates our world and our reality depends entirely upon our mind? So around this meditation practice thread, we will explore this non-dual view that I mentioned that lies behind the vast array of expressions of enlightenment that make up the Tibetan Buddhist world. We will establish this view carefully in the Nalanda style of combining study and reflection with that thread of meditation practice. And during our discussions, we will explore some of the paradoxes we briefly just discussed, like how is it possible for a non-dual, non-theistic tradition like Tibetan Buddhism to have so much expressions at the same time of devotion and emphasize the notion of deities and gurus and blessings and prayers? Also, for those of us who are not attracted to all these Vajrayana expressions of enlightenment and these seemingly theistic practices based on blessings and empowerments, how can we meaningfully relate to this bigger context of our foundational or Mahayana paths as we are studying and practicing those? Because we can also decide to practice the Mahayana path of the Bodhisattva without these Vajrayana Buddhist elements. But nevertheless, these Vajrayana elements are always there in our Tibetan Buddhist context. So we're going to explore how we can somehow find a meaningful relationship with them, even though they may not be our main path. And for those of us who have taken the Vajrayana as their main path, this weekend will be an opportunity to deepen the view behind these Vajrayana practices. Because in the Vajrayana, it is emphasized so strongly again and again that for the methods of the Vajrayana to work, we need to really be deeply grounded in the view behind these practices, this non-dual view, this union of appearance and emptiness. So that's a little bit about how all this is going to come to bear on the weekend of the 7th and 8th of June. We will, during this weekend, start at 9 o'clock every day and have 4 separate sessions on the Saturday, finish at around 4:30 in the afternoon. Between sessions, there will be generous breaks for that offer space for personal reflection and connecting with other participants. And then on Sunday, we'll have 3 sessions. We'll finish at 3 p.m. to give everyone the time and space to also, go back home and finish whatever else they need to do during their weekend. So that's a little bit about what makes Tibetan Buddhism so special.